I'm new to Nisi Shawl's writing, so this is okay. Okay, body. Work with me, body. All right, we shall start over. Hi everyone, welcome back to Onyx Pages. I'm going to get right into the review of Everfair by Nisi Shawl. So Everfair is this book. It is a novel by Nisi Shawl. It is their first novel. Yes, their first novel. So congratulations for writing your first novel. So Nisi Shawl is not new to writing, obviously. They've written a lot of great short stories and a lot of amazing anthologies, which I should have brought, but I'm looking at Stories for Chip. I'm looking at a couple of essays written in Strange Matings. I'm looking at the short story collection Filter House, and there are a number of other electronically published short stories. I am new to Nisi's work. Sorry, I'm about to sneeze. I'm a bit of a cold. So in terms of what the book is about, the story is set in a number of different places, but it's largely set in Africa, in the region known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but the region that was colonized by King Leopold II. So this story is what Nisi Shawl calls Afro-Retrofuturism, because it asks the question, well, what would have happened in the Congo had African people at the time access to STEAM technology? So it is a steampunk novel in that genre, and I enjoyed it. So I'm just going to go into the 7 cowrie shell review, and I will share my thoughts that way. So, as you know, the first cowrie shell is about plot, and I gave Everfair half a cowrie shell for plot. I found the plot to be beautiful, nuanced, complex. It really got me asking a lot of questions that I didn't expect to ask when I first embarked on the project of reading the novel. It got me thinking about politics, about democracy, about allegiances and alliances. It got me thinking about geography, colonization in a very different way. It got me thinking about a different part of Africa from where my folks are probably originated. And then it put queerness into the mix in a way that I just haven't seen in this kind of novel. So I found it layered and beautiful. Now the book, you should know, is divided into 2 parts. So the first part is about, what do we do about King Leopold II and the awful, horrendous and terrifying colonization of the Congo. What do we do about this? How do we get rid of and overthrow Leopold? And then the second part is, okay, so now that that's done, what's that going to be replaced with? And what's that leadership going to be looking like? And how is that transition going to happen? And what is the future going to hold and bring? And will the alliances that existed in order to overthrow Leopold be able to remain intact, and should they remain intact afterwards? So they're two very different literary projects in the different parts of the story. So the themes that I really enjoyed, I've got my laptop here and I'm looking at all my notes that I very diligently put together because I'm being quite responsible today. So I enjoyed the theme of, what is the alternative to colonization, or what are the alternatives to colonization? And that question of, what if we just changed one thing? What if we went back into history and changed just one thing? How would that impact the course of events going forward all the way to today? I found that really fascinating. Was there a place for queer love in Africa in the mid 1800s and the early 1900s. Were there queer Africans? Were there queer relationships at that time? How did they happen? How did they exist? Were people safe? What did they do? Where did they do it? All of those questions about love and relationships. And there were so many tensions and contradictions in the story, like the tension between the magical and the mundane, the tension between the foreign and the traditional, tension between, patriarchal and non-patriarchal forms of leadership, tension between European continent, Asia, Africa, North America, tensions in terms of generations of people working together and approaching problems, the collective versus the individual, just so much in tension here that got me excited. And there are also themes about love and relationship and romance and sex and monogamy and polygamy that got me thinking as well. So I really enjoyed everything that I read. So you might be asking, well, if you enjoyed it so much, and Jerry, why didn't you give it a whole cowrie shell? What happened to that other half? Well, here's the thing. It took me a while to get into learning how to read this novel, longer than other novels. It took me until about halfway to the end of part 1 for me to realize a couple of things. Number 1, Everfair demands your respect, your time, and your attention. Undivided attention. This is not a story that can be read and fits and starts while you're on the GO train or on the subway or while you're waiting for your food to come or in that 15 minutes before you go to bed. This story needs attention. It's a demand. I described it to them as a demanding read. And so I got a lot more out of part 2 than I did out of part 1. And I know that this is the way that I approached it, but I have to say that affected my reading experience. So technically, I thought that the plot was incredible, and it left me wanting to learn more about Everfair and about the different worlds related to Everfair. But it was something that was difficult for me to move through. Okay, so the second cowrie shell is about characters, and I gave this 1 full cowrie shell for characters. I believe that Everfair is written, if you add it all up, written from 11 different viewpoints. The chapters are very short, so you can have like a 5 or 6 page chapter, and each chapter will be written from a point of view that is different from the chapter before. Now, because Nisi is awesome, they gave us a couple of pages of, okay, I don't even know. You know how we do this. There we go. Like notable characters. So there's a list of European characters, ASEAN characters, African characters, and East Asian characters. And so we're given when they were born, when they died, who they were. So that was a really great reference point as I was reading, because some characters you meet on page 56 and then you don't hear from them or anything about them again until 292, and then you're like, who's this person? Where are they from? And I really wish all novels would be so kind as to do that. So we experience the characters in snapshots, and we learn about them by observing their decisions. At least that was my experience. So we've got an omniscient narrator in this story, and the narrator takes us into the minds of all of these different characters. What are they thinking? What are they trying to figure out? When do they change their mind? When do they decide to take action? When do they decide to pull back? And that's where we learn more about characters, as opposed to stories where you've got the narrator saying, well, you know, this is Lisette, and she was born here, and this is what motivates her, and this is why she decided to take this particular action. So you have to deduce a lot from the information that you're given in these tiny morsels of text about each character. And I watched a lot of reviews before I I did this review and before I concluded my thoughts. And I know that some folks found that jarring. I didn't find it jarring. I felt like it was an approach. It changed my approach to the reading. And so I just had to figure out how to embrace that. So while I did find it challenging to follow the plot along because of the staccato rhythm of the story, I didn't find it difficult to connect with the characters. Although I will say we had a lot of breadth of the characters and only really got into depth on some of the primary characters, and a lot of the secondary characters kind of came and went. But in a way that for me was still satisfying. I got something, but I didn't get as much as I wanted. So it certainly left me wanting more. It was like a really, when you go to a restaurant and you get a really nice meal, but it doesn't leave you full, you're kind of like, I kind of want another one, which is, I guess, what the people at the restaurant want you to feel when you leave. So the character development was subtle and nuanced. I could relate with a number of the characters. I related a little too well with some of the characters I didn't like, but that's between me and my soul and not for me to tell you about, but it definitely got me to think about myself in different ways. And I also cared about the characters. Like I was rooting for some of the characters. I wanted some of them to change in ways that would have, I think, changed the course of events in a positive way. I wanted some of them to forgive each other and to get over that, that kind of personality flaw, or to just get over it, or to try something new, or to just disappear. I started caring about them, so that was really good. So full cowrie shell for characters. For the world building, another full cowrie shell. I really enjoyed watching Everfair become Everfair. I love the idea that there are like 2 levels of world building. I just realized this. So there's the world building that Nisi actually does, but then there's the world building that the characters are doing, because they too are imagining a world to replace the colonized world created by the evil King Leopold II. So we are participating in this collective world building. We've got a number of different political interests in conflict with each other. So we have this Fabian society, which is kind of like this socialist group that has this idea. And then we've got these African-American missionaries who also have this very Christian idea. And then we have King Wemba, and he's got this sort of African traditionalist, sort of monarchist perspective on what needs to happen on land. And then you've got people who are within these different groups, but also trying to tussle with the contradictions of their own framing of what Everfair ought to be. And so all of this kind of comes together in this mishmash, which was really amazing to experience. Way more politics than I expected. So it really got me thinking about like my political science studies, and I started thinking about democracy, and I started thinking about leadership and patriarchy and alternatives to patriarchy and white feminism and where the queer space is and engineering and all that kind of stuff. So it was very educational, which was great because I learned some things, but it also kind of got difficult to get through because I didn't want to return back to my undergrad, and Nisi made me. Thanks. In terms of LGBTQ content, a full cowrie shell for that, because there is a lot of queer love up in the place. So there is a beautiful love triangle, but it was more of an isosceles and not an equilateral triangle. So it was an elongated love triangle that I know I watched a review by Donica, I think it was Donica, who was saying that like love triangles aren't typically, like lesbian love triangles are typically not her thing. And I love a love triangle, but I found this one really gentle, right? And really relatable, I think, actually. And the love, there was like a fast love on one side of the triangle and then like a slow burning love on the other. And it was nice because lesbians are complicated. So, it was good. That was cool. There was also some gender queerness. There was some interruption and questioning about masculinity. There was also like non-monogamous relationships that had to interact in a society that didn't regard non-monogamous relationships as appropriate. So there were a lot of different kinds of relationships that that presented themselves in the story, and a lot of queerness in a lot of different ways, and even like the presentation of femininity and feminine strength and all of that. Really good. So one full cowrie shell for LGBT content. Was it Afrofuturist? Is this an Afrofuturist novel? It absolutely is. In fact, it is Afro-retrofuturist, so take that. In my view, it was Afrofuturist specifically because we have this marriage of technology and Africa, and by thinking about what the past would have been like had technology and science played a particular role at the time, being able to look at that and then project that into the future, it really got me thinking, well, what would my life and my experience have been like? So let's say, for example, let's say that the people of the Congo did have access to these magical technologies, the steam-powered technology at that time. Well, what probably would have happened is that knowledge would have spread across the continent. And if that knowledge spread across the continent, it would have affected my ancestors. And if it did affect my ancestors in a similar way as it did in the story, i.e. to interrupt colonization, then maybe my people would never have left the continent. Maybe I wouldn't have been a Trini. Maybe I wouldn't have been Canadian. So it really got me thinking about me and myself right now, and how my people got to where they got, and how technology emerging earlier in my lineage would have affected my life right now. So totally Afrofuturist. And so did it challenge societal norms? I would say absolutely. So one full cowrie shell for challenging societal norms. I think the biggest norm that it challenged, the story did, was the norm of colonization. But also, right, so Nisi's Everfair pokes holes into the frailties of the colonial project, which is a big old problem, so it's not like that was hard to do. But then socialism and patriarchy and Christianity and African religions and like all sorts of different things, right? Like women aren't doing things that women would ordinarily do. The way that she imagines an African queen as a political leader and as somebody who has significant influence over the king, just things that I don't typically see in Afrofuturist texts. So a full cowrie shell for challenging societal norms. And a lot of the comments that I made specifically about LGBT characters and about the world building are both examples of the challenging of societal norms. And then finally, a full cowrie shell for aspirational, because this is a hopeful story, and there is something very exciting about being able to look at history and say, well, what would have happened had this one thing changed? Like, I think that's a powerful question to ask. And even though what happened in the past did happen, sometimes looking at the past differently actually changes what happened, right? If you think about conflict, if you think about somebody in your life that you had a conflict with, right? And you have your own version of what they did. But then 15 years later, you find out that you were actually wrong about something. And then you look back, you start seeing the situation differently, right? Maybe the relationships change. Maybe you think about yourself differently, right? Like, it actually does change things when you start to get more information about something that happened in the past. And so, yeah, I'm still thinking about it. It's still lingering. So there we go. So adding that all together, we've got 6.5 stars. No, not stars. We don't do stars at this point, at this joint. 6.5 cowries for Everfair by the wonderful Nisi Shawl. So now I'm going to pause. We're going to fade to black, and then we're going to come back, and I will be interviewing the wonderful Nisi Shawl, who decided to share some of their day with us today. So For those of you in the Onyx Pages land, I am here with Nisi Shawl, and Nisi is the author of Everfair, which I have devoured, and I've been talking about reading for quite some time and spent most of July and some of August reading, and finished yesterday. So I'm sort of fresh in my thoughts and fresh in my feelings about the book. So thank you for spending a little bit of time with me. So I have a bunch of questions here for you on my phone. And of course, the screen has gone dark, which is what happens.
Yep.
What happens. So in preparation for our interview, I've watched reviews from other booktubers on YouTube about the book, and I've also just kind of gathered my own thoughts about it. And I know the way that I described Everfair on my videos, but I'm curious about what would your sort of elevator speech be about Everfair? In your view, what is the story or the stories about?
The story is about the country. It's not about the people in the country. The story is about a country that is created by an amalgamation of African American missionaries, European socialists, and African indigenes, who are all opposed to King Leopold II's supposed ownership of the Congo.
Gotcha. So when you were putting the story together, and when you actually made the decision that you were going to write a novel called Everfair, was there a particular need or gap in the literature that you felt this story needed to fill? Like, what was your motivation for writing this?
It was a huge gap. I looked at myself. I should have been like a dyed-in-the-wool, a fervent supporter of steampunk, and I was not. It kind of squicked me. It kind of made me throw up a little in my mouth. And I thought that I was a natural for this because I adore Victorian literature, and steampunk revolves around the aesthetic and history of the Victorian period. I have a real kind of a kink for machines, for gear. It's, like all things steampunky are like gears and gadgets and bellows, and that stuff just does it for me. But the problem, as I learned by investigating my feelings when I was going to be on a panel about steampunk at World Fantasy, the World Fantasy Convention, the problem is that most of the steampunk that I had encountered, and most of what most people encounter, really supports and validates the presence of colonialism and imperialist motives and narratives, and I could not swallow any more of that. So I decided that I was going to rise to the challenge and write something that would, have made me happy to read, something that was set in that period, that explored the gadgetry and the physical attributes of steampunk without leaving out the histories of the people who were resisting colonialization. Did I do it?
I think you did it.
Yay!
I think you did it. I'll confess, yours is the first steampunk novel I've read, so I feel like I'm not sure that I would be able to answer that question in its fullness. But interesting that you say that, because I did watch one video of a booktuber, and in her view, steampunk is both, there's the steam element, right, the gadgets and all of that, and then there's like the punk, the kind of incursion on a particular worldview or on a particular way of doing things. And in her view, she felt that Everfair got the steam part but didn't get the punk part because there wasn't that interruption of societal norms. And I actually disagree with that, because in my view, there were so many things about the world that you built that were actual interruptions, whether it was interrupting patriarchy, whether it was interrupting colonization, whether it was interrupting African traditionalism, like there were just, whether it was interrupting monogamy, like there were all sorts of kinds of interruptions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of like, okay, I mean, I hear you, but I hear you, other reviewer, and I disagree, but I feel like that critique got me to appreciate what you accomplished in this story, a lot more than I would have had I not heard it. So I think that it certainly accomplished what you were looking for. Um, One of the things that drew me to Everfair, and I'm going to be doing a review of it, and I found part one, as I mentioned to you offline, challenging to get through, and then I found part two easier to get through. And I've been reflecting even since 1 o'clock in the morning when we had our online chat. 1 o'clock for me, it was like, I don't know, ungodly o'clock for you, but I was thinking about, why did I find part two easier than part three? And part two easier than part one to get through. I think one was the way that I was reading it. I feel that it demanded my attention, because of the subtlety and the nuances, not only of the steampunk part of it, but because the chapters were short, we didn't get a lot of time with each character. In each chapter, so you really couldn't blink, right? And I was reading it on the subway, and 5 minutes before bed, and it's just like, wait, Leopold, who's Tink, Lizette, like Daisy, like all of these kinds of characters coming together. And I realized that halfway through the book, that I needed to approach my reading differently. I really needed to honor the whole text together and cut out distractions so that I could have an immersive experience. And the minute I did that, like everything just kind of came alive in a different way. That actually got me thinking maybe I should read part one again in longer intervals so that I could get the fullness of the story. But my question is about tension, because there are a lot of different kinds of tension in the story as it evolves, right? Certainly tensions between community, between political perspectives, between characters, between different kinds of technology, the speed of change, lots of different tension. And I'm wondering which of the types of tension that you dealt with in the story, which of those were the most compelling for you, or which of those tensions did you feel most excited to explore, and why?
Wow. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I truly think that tension is really the heart of story. People talk about conflict, and I'm like, no, it's tension. It's not like this. It's like this. For me, the most exciting tension was the tension between what people wanted to do and what they wound up doing. And so that was pretty much the case for every character. They, were going to do this, and they wound up doing that. And what that meant to them. So in the case of Jackie, for instance, he wanted to bring an end to colonization by basically holding a bunch of white people hostage. There's no spoiler there. That pretty much comes out in the first few chapters. And that is not what happens. That is not what happens at all. So yeah, that throughout all the different characters, intention and then event.
One of the aspects of the story that I admired the most, and that really drew me in, was the magical spiritual elements of the story, in particular Queen Josina, and King Wemba, but also Wendy. And so I was thinking, like, and I would describe those elements as magical realism as opposed to, like, fancy or Afrofuturism or anything like that. But there wasn't a lot of it throughout the story. You sort of had these chapters where we just kind of got transported to this other world or this other dimension of the story. How did you decide how much magic you were going to put in this story and where to put it? How did you go about doing that?
That wasn't really a conscious decision on my part. It was a reflection of my real life experience. I never thought, oh, time for some magic. I always thought, time for something to happen, and magic was how it happened. So, one person asked me why all the magic realism stemmed from the experiences of Black people. And I had not thought of that, but actually, I mean, there's Fundy, Thomas has magical experiences, Queen Josina in particular. I don't know, Black magic, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I noticed that. I wasn't mad at it. I actually quite liked it, but for me, what I most enjoy about Afrofuturism, and I'm not sure if you consider Everfair to be an Afrofuturist novel, I do, and that whether Afrofuturism is a genre or not is a bit of a controversial question, I know, and we can go there and chat about that for sure. But I see the way that magic emerged in the story as sort of a tool of like freedom or resolving, just sort of getting over, right? Like getting through a problem on the way to some kind of like freedom or emancipation or better experience.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the Fabian society sort of had politics as their tool, and just sort of deliberations and alliances, and that was the tool that they were trying to use, negotiation to get over. And so it would have been strange for me to see magic pop up there. It made sense to me that the groups that were motivated by spirituality would use magic more readily than any of the other groups. So for me, it wasn't so much race and Africanism that connected me to the magic, or that connected the characters to the magic, but more the strategies that they were trying to adopt to achieve their goals. I mean, that was my experience.
Yeah, I think it is a more cultural thing. Lisette, who is mixed race, she's European, and she has some Afro-diasporic blood in her. She doesn't do magic.
No.
She's sort of like cynical about it when Josina tries to get her to, do certain things to make the diplomatic ploys work better.
Yeah, although I do notice that she is sort of a magic adjacent, and she seems to be able to coexist with magic in a way with like ease that some of the other characters weren't able to do. So like comparing her relationship to magic to like Mattie's, for example, I noticed a significant difference, right? Like,
yeah, you're right. Yeah,
I wonder if, I mean, at that point, I could probably see how race might have had something to do with. Maybe it was that like that African part of her that made her more able to, to see that other side. I don't know. I maybe don't want to go down that road too far. But do you consider Everfair to be an Afrofuturist novel? I think I know your answer.
I coined the term Afro-retrofuturist for it.
Okay, and what's Afro-retrofuturism? I think we talked about
So,
this in Amsterdam, actually.
so retrofuturism is one of the things that steampunk calls itself, and I do like to respect what people call themselves. So retrofuturism, and then Afro-retrofuturism, because it's really focused on the African experience. It takes place, there are parts that take place in Puerto Rico, in Ireland, but most of it takes place like in Cameroon, Congo, primarily, Angola, so different African countries.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's Afro-retrofuturism, um, looking at the past as if it were as malleable as the future.
Right, which some would say it is,
Yes,
right?
right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about sex and romance because you know how we do. So out of all of the romances and trysts in the story, which was the juiciest for you to write? Which did you enjoy the most?
Gosh, I am really torn. I had a lot of fun writing Lizette's liaisons.
Mm,
Um, there's one with Daisy. What I was trying to do in that was mimic the style of writing that Colette does, because Lisette is very closely modeled on the actual historical figure Colette. So
and
it's
who
just
is
like
sorry to interrupt. Who is Colette?
Oh, Colette was a mixed race French writer of the late 19th and up to the mid 20th century.
Okay.
Um, she was a fascinating figure. Everybody needs to find out about her because, wow, she was bisexual, she was an actress, she was a writer, she was probably a spy. Um, yeah, and she was just irrepressible. But anyway, so in her writing, she talks a lot about sensuality and sex, um, but in very veiled terms, because she was writing a lot of this in the 19th and early 20th century.
Mhm.
So the liaison between Daisy and Lisette, there's like, oh, all this sort of gauziness over the camera, and they're like, happiness, happiness. And then there's Lisette's uh, union with Rima in the steam shed, and that's from the point of view of Rima, and Rima is much more frank. She'll talk about like somebody's pussy. I mean, she's just like, she's right there. And that was also fun. I read that one aloud a lot.
Yeah,
I warn people, but I say sex in this one, and then I go,
we're grown. Um,
yeah.
yeah, I enjoyed. I think I enjoyed Daisy a lot more than I thought I would have when I met her at the beginning of the story. She ended up being a lot more complex and a lot more familiar, especially around her politics. I mean, she exhausted me, but and I'm like, really? Come on now. Really? And then I had to remember the times and all of that stuff, right? So reading her in 2018 was tedious in a way that was very instructive for me. um, but I really liked how she approached the romance with Lisette. And the pace of it was it was nice. It was difficult, but I really liked it. And I appreciated that we started with Lisette at the beginning, and we see her as this like teen and the world's her oyster, and then we end with her as well. So that was a nice way to close it all. So I have as my final set of questions like a 3 lightning round questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, which character from Everfair would you most want to meet in real life, and why?
Oh, Lisette, absolutely. Um, because, oh, she's so smart and she's so funny and so observant and so wise. Yes, I would really like to hang out with Lizette.
Which fight or battle scene was the most fun to write?
The most fun to write was the one with the air canoes.
The last, like the one right at the end?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there were plenty of them with air canoes, but yeah, the one with actually Thomas fighting against King Wenda, and the gradual descent of the air canoe. Yeah, that was fun.
And which corner of the Everfair world would you most like to expand on in other work, or just in your own imagination?
Which part of it? Probably Egypt. I mean, that's where I set a short story sequel, and that's like, it was going through some interesting times then, I'll just say that, and the influence of Everfair would have been really fun to watch.
Yeah. I know that you're working on other things. I'm not sure how public you are about them right now, but for those of us who are thirsty for more of the Everfair multiverse, where would we go to find short stories or flash fiction, or what's coming down the pipes?
So I have 3 short stories out already that are more or less Everfair adjacent. There's a horror story, which is the only thing I've written from Leopold's viewpoint. It's called Vulcanization, and it's up at Nightmare Magazine, I believe. Okay. Then there's a short story which, as we record this, is still being considered for the Sidewise Award, which is an award for alternate history. So yeah, in a couple of hours it won't be considered anymore, but for now I'm basking in the consideration. And that story is called Sun River, and that's in an anthology called Clockwork Cairo. That one is set in Egypt. And then another one called The Colors of Money is in an anthology called Sun Vault. And that one takes place on an island near Everfair. It's the island of Zanzibar. Okay. So, yeah. And that one involves Rosalie and Laurie.
Oh, okay. I'm
Yeah.
going to do my best to put links to the anthologies and the websites that you've mentioned so that folks can find your work.
Okay.
So as a queer woman, as a queer Black woman, it was really wonderful to read this work of Afrofuturism. And in particular because I think that a lot of African traditionalism just erases the queer experience to the point where those of us who are trying to trace our lineages back, or like sexual identity lineages back, sometimes hit a brick wall, right? Where we're told there were no queer folks ever in Africa. This is a thing that came from the West in like the 1980s or whatever it is. And so it was really nice to read this work, and I'm so glad that it was unapologetically and so delicately queer. I very much appreciate that. So thank you for writing it. And I just want to leave the floor open to you if there's anything else about Everfair that you would like to share or mention to the BookTube community before we finish.
I guess I should have mentioned that I am now under contract to work on a novel sequel also called Kinning. Kinning is going to be from 2 points of view, or actually 4 points of view. Okay, but not 11, 4. And it's going to be from the viewpoints of Tink and his sister Bilung, and then from Princess Mwadi and Prince Ilunga.
Okay. I'm intrigued by Tink.
Yeah. Tink came out of nowhere, actually.
Yeah.
Tink, I was doing my research to begin the story. I mean, I research all the time, as I'm writing. But I did a bunch at the beginning and found out that there were Chinese railroad workers that Leopold had imported from Macau so that he could have them build a railroad from the port up into the navigable stretches of the Congo River. And then they all said, well, this is horrible. Fuck this shit. Which way is east? Okay, we're going. And they did not get to Macau, but they did leave a really strong presence in that area.
Okay.
That there are actually you can trace Chinese traditions that were brought to various towns in the Congo by these people who were running away from Leopold. So I was like, oh, well, let's personify that. And that was Tink.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. There's a chapter. There's some really beautiful moments between Tink and his sister, and a chapter towards the end. And I don't want to give away as a spoiler, but Tink makes an important decision, and we get some insight into Tink's decision, but not everything. And so I appreciate what you shared with me right now. What you've shared with us gives me a little bit more context for understanding Tink's decision and how he appeared and disappeared and reappeared as the plot unfolded. So I appreciate that. This must have taken a lot of this is probably, like, just reading it myself, probably the most well-researched work of fiction that I've read, just because there's just so much detail in the technology, in the history, the politics. This is the most political story I've read. I wasn't ready. I had to, now I'm going to be spoiling some of the things that I said in my review, but I started thinking about my political science degree. I started thinking about democracy and all that kind of stuff, things that I didn't want to think about, but I ended up thinking about, and I guess I should be thinking about in these times. So it was good. I really loved it. So thank you very much for writing Everfair. Thank you for the gift of Everfair. And also thank you for the gift of your time today.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yay! Okay, we are done. So for those of you who are watching on BookTube or anywhere else, this was our interview with the fabulous Nisi Shawl, who's over there. And I will be putting up links in the description area of the video to all of the different works that Nisi has mentioned during our discussion today. So thanks very much, everybody, for watching. Bye.